We tend to assume the deadliest things humans ever built were weapons: spears, arrows, gunpowder, the bomb. Tools designed for one purpose: ending another person's life. But the single event that came closest to wiping out an entire sex of our species did not start with a weapon. It started with a seed pressed into soil. Somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, across a window of roughly 2,000 years, something happened to men. Not to humans generally, to men specifically, across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And according to the geneticists who found it, the trigger traces back to farming. The discovery sits inside our own bodies. Every cell carries DNA, and within that DNA is a running record of what happened to our ancestors long before anyone wrote anything down. In 2015, population geneticist Monica Carmen and her team at the University of Tartu compared two different genetic lines carried by modern humans. The first is the Y chromosome, passed from father to son and changed only slightly from generation to generation. The second is mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, carried by everyone but only transmitted onward by women. Carmen's team found that Y chromosome diversity collapsed sharply starting around 7,000 years ago, and kept falling for roughly 2,000 years before recovering. Mitochondrial diversity did nothing of the sort. It kept climbing the entire time. Whatever caused this, it hit male lineages specifically, and left female lineages alone. That distinction matters because a bottleneck, a term for any sharp drop in a population's genetic diversity, usually comes from something that kills indiscriminately. A volcanic eruption, a famine, a plague. Those disasters do not check whether their victims are men or women before they strike. A bottleneck that hits only one sex is a different kind of event, and it points towards something social rather than environmental. Something that specifically targeted men, generation after generation, for 2,000 years straight. Carmen's data suggested the male effective population, an estimate of how many men were actually contributing genetically to future generations, dropped to somewhere around 1/20th of its earlier size. In practical terms, later commentary on her findings described the ratio as roughly 17 women for every fertile man left standing. No war in recorded history, not the First World War, not the Second, comes close to that kind of loss by percentage. To recreate something similar today, using current world population figures, you would need to kill somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.9 billion men and leave around 200 million standing. That is the scale we are talking about, condensed into 2,000 years and possibly less. 2,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that is barely a blink. Carmen's team was not the only group to find this. A separate analysis of 26 populations from the 1,000 Genomes Project turned up the same drop in male effective population size using an entirely different data set. Geneticist Chiara Bettini and colleagues then confirmed the pattern again, working from Y chromosome sequences collected across 17 populations in Europe and the Near East. 3 separate research teams, 3 separate data sets, and the same basic signal turned up each time. The exact timing of the bottleneck shifts depending on which region of the Old World you look at, which is itself a clue. In the Near East, where farming started earliest, the drop appears to begin around 8,300 years ago. In Europe, later researchers using slightly different mutation rate calculations dated the steepest part of the collapse to somewhere between 4,200 and 2,100 years ago. In Siberia, on the far edge of where agriculture eventually spread, the same signal does not show up until roughly 1,400 years ago. The bottleneck, in other words, does not arrive everywhere at once as a single global catastrophe would. It arrives on a rolling schedule that tracks almost exactly with when each region adopted farming and settled into fixed communities. A plague or an asteroid does not wait for agriculture to arrive in Siberia before affecting Siberia. A social structure that spreads along with farming does exactly that. The timing lines up almost exactly with a separate, much better documented shift. The Neolithic Revolution, the point where large parts of humanity stopped following herds and wild plants and started staying in one place to grow food on purpose. That timing is not a coincidence. It is the whole explanation. Before agriculture, human groups moved. Hunting and foraging require covering ground, following seasonal resources, and that constant movement does not favor rigid, permanent social units or fixed territory worth dying over. Farming breaks that arithmetic completely. A field has to be tended in the same place, year after year. A herd needs pasture nearby, watched and defended. Grain, once harvested, has to be stored somewhere. Once people commit to staying put, they also commit to defending what they have built, and defending it well enough to keep other groups from simply taking it instead of growing their own. That single shift, from mobile foraging to fixed settlement, created something that had barely existed before, on any meaningful scale: property. And property, once it exists, has to be protected. A hunter-gatherer group that loses a bad season can simply move toward better ground. A farming settlement that loses its stored grain to a raid in the weeks before the next harvest faces starvation with nowhere obvious to walk to instead. That kind of stakes, survival tied directly to a fixed patch of land and whatever is stored on it, gives neighboring groups a reason to fight that mobile foragers rarely had. A genetic signal this strange invites a simple follow-up question. If something erased that many men, where are the bodies? As it turns out, archaeologists have been digging them up for decades, and the pattern they keep finding lines up with the genetic data almost too well. Neolithic skeletons across Europe are notorious among researchers for the amount of trauma they carry, especially compared to the humans who came immediately before and after them. One broad survey of more than 2,300 early farmers found that over 10% showed injuries consistent with weapons, likely from raids on crops, livestock, or stored grain. That number alone would be striking on its own. It is also almost certainly an undercount. Bioarchaeologists studying this period estimate that a large share of fatal blows from sharp or bladed weapons never leave a mark on bone at all. Add in death from infection, from wounds that never fully healed, and from soft tissue injuries that leave no skeletal trace, and the true rate of violent death climbs well past what any single skeleton can prove on its own. One of the clearest single-site examples comes from a re-examination of skeletal remains at San Juan ante Portum Latinum, a rock shelter burial site in northern Spain dated to the very end of the Neolithic. Researchers there analyzed 338 individuals and found that 23.1% showed some sign of violent trauma, either healed or unhealed. Break that number down by sex, and the pattern sharpens considerably. Adolescent and adult males accounted for 97.6% of the unhealed injuries and 81.7% of the healed ones. Healed trauma matters here because it means these men survived one violent encounter only to be struck again later. Getting attacked once was apparently common enough in this period to be survivable. Getting attacked more than once, over the course of an ordinary life, was common too. The site also produced 52 flint arrowheads, more than 36 of which showed impact damage consistent with striking a target rather than simple wear. Researchers studying the site note that the true casualty count is likely higher still, since arrow wounds to soft tissue rarely leave any mark on bone at all, meaning the skeletal record can only ever capture a floor, not a ceiling, on how much violence actually took place there. Even the shape of Neolithic settlements themselves supports this picture. Archaeologists studying the wider farming culture behind these sites, known as the linear pottery culture, have repeatedly found villages ringed by ditches and palisades. Wooden fence lines dug into the earth and reinforced, clearly built for defense rather than simply to pen livestock. A community does not spend the labor to dig and maintain a defensive perimeter around a few dozen farmhouses, unless raids are a real, recurring possibility, rather than a rare disaster. These fortifications show up at multiple unrelated sites across the same general period, which suggests the threat they were built against was widespread, rather than local to any single unlucky village. For a fuller picture of what that violence actually looked like on the ground, 4 sites stand out, and taken together they read less like isolated incidents and more like a pattern repeating itself across an entire region for centuries. The first is a farming settlement in southern Germany called Talheim, discovered in 1983, and radiocarbon dated to around 5000 BC. Excavators there found a mass grave containing 34 bodies, 16 children, 9 adult men, 7 adult women, and 2 adults whose sex could not be determined. Every skeleton in the pit showed fatal trauma, mostly blows to the head from stone tools, with a handful of arrow wounds mixed in. Several individuals also carried older, healed fractures, meaning they had already survived earlier violent encounters before the one that killed them. None of the skeletons showed defensive wounds on the arms or hands, the kind you would expect from someone trying to block an incoming strike. That absence suggests these people were caught while fleeing rather than while fighting back. Young adult women were noticeably underrepresented among the dead, a detail that shows up again and again at sites like this one, and points toward abduction rather than simple massacre. Isotope analysis of the teeth recovered at Talheim adds another layer to the picture. That kind of analysis can reveal where a person spent their childhood based on trace chemical signatures absorbed from local water and food. At Talheim, the results suggest the victims did not all grow up in one place. Several distinct childhood locations are represented among the dead, meaning this was not simply one village wiped out by a single rival next door. It looks more like a settlement that had drawn people in from multiple surrounding communities before all of them were killed together. The second site sits about 30 kilometers north of Vienna, near the modern village of Schletz. Archaeologists there uncovered a defensive ditch surrounding an early farming settlement, and inside it, the remains of at least 67 people, all showing blunt force trauma, consistent with the same kind of stone tools used at Talheim. Only about a fifth of the ditch has ever been excavated, which means the true body count is almost certainly higher. Current estimates place it above 200 individuals for the site as a whole. Of the 67 bodies actually recovered, 27 were children, 26 were adolescent or adult men, and only 13 were women. A skew that gets worse once you consider how many of the missing young women may have been taken rather than killed. As at Talheim, the settlement itself was fortified, walled off from its neighbors, which tells you something about how normal the threat of attack had become by this point in the Neolithic. A society does not build defensive earthworks around a farming village unless it has good reason to expect an attack. The third site was found near Frankfurt, at a location called Schöneck-Kilienstätten, and it introduces a detail the first two sites do not show. Excavators recovered at least 26 individuals, mostly children and men, killed by blunt force blows to the head and by arrows. What sets this site apart is the legs. More than half of the recovered shin bones had been deliberately broken, either shortly before death or immediately after, in a pattern researchers describe as evidence of torture or mutilation, rather than a byproduct of ordinary combat. That is not the kind of damage a chaotic fight leaves behind. Someone took their time. As with Talheim and Schletz, very few remains of young women turned up at the site, reinforcing the idea that women were being taken rather than killed alongside the men. The fourth site is the strangest of the four, and it sits near the town of Herxheim, also in southwestern Germany. Excavators there found the remains of roughly 1,000 people, deposited into a network of pits over a period researchers estimate at less than 50 years. That is not a single massacre. That is a settlement of maybe a few dozen residents at any given time, somehow processing the remains of 1,000 people across 2 generations. Among the recovered material were more than 170 skulls and partial skull caps, a number of them fractured in a specific, repeated way that left thin, deliberately shaped rims rather than random breaks. The remains were found concentrated in a series of overlapping, elongated pits arranged in rings around the edge of the settlement, rather than scattered randomly across the site, which suggests a repeated, organized process rather than one chaotic event. The bones show extensive cutting and fracturing, much of it consistent with deliberate defleshing, and some researchers argue this points toward ritual cannibalism. Others disagree, arguing the pattern is better explained by a secondary burial practice that involved breaking down remains without necessarily eating them. The debate over which explanation fits the evidence is still active among the archaeologists who study the site. What both sides agree on is that whatever happened at Herxheim was not accidental, and it was not a single event. Out of every site on this list, it is the one I would least want an invitation to. Across all 4 sites, the weapons recovered tell a consistent story. Adzes, a woodworking tool with a blade set perpendicular to the handle, show up as the most common cause of head trauma, alongside spears, bows, arrows, axes, and clubs. the same set of everyday farming and hunting tools repurposed for close-range killing rather than any weapon built for war alone. Armor, by contrast, is essentially absent from the archaeological record of this period. Fighters wore animal hide or woven cloth at most. Nothing built to stop a stone blade or an arrowhead. Bring farming tools to what is essentially a fight with no rules, and someone is going home with a fractured skull. Combine constant exposure to close-range weapons with no real protective gear, and you get a population where simply reaching adulthood counted as an accomplishment. Estimates for Neolithic life expectancy put the average adult male lifespan somewhere between 20 and 33 years, among the shortest of any period in the archaeological record, matched only by a handful of much later eras with their own separate causes. Even accounting for high infant mortality skewing that average downward, a man who survived childhood still faced a real chance of not seeing his mid-30s. Not from disease or accident, but from another man carrying an axe. None of this fully explains why the killing was so specifically aimed at men, though. The skeletons confirm men were dying violently and often. They do not, on their own, explain why that violence was concentrated enough to leave a permanent scar on the human Y chromosome. For that, researchers point toward a shift in how society itself was organized, one that traces directly back to the same farming settlements the skeletons came from. Two explanations for what happened next currently compete in the research, and both start from the same building block: the patrilineal clan, a social unit built around a shared male bloodline, where sons stayed with their father's group for life, and daughters married outward into other clans. The first explanation comes from a 2018 study by Stanford researchers Tien-Chen Zeng, Alan Aw, and Marcus Feldman. Their team ran 18 separate simulated scenarios, testing everything from ordinary death rates to different assumptions about mutation speed and intergroup competition, to see which conditions could actually reproduce the numbers Carmen's team had found. Under a patrilineal clan system, every man in a given clan carried a nearly identical Y chromosome, inherited unchanged from a single founding ancestor. If two patrilineal clans went to war, and one lost badly enough to be wiped out or absorbed, an entire branch of the human Y chromosome tree could disappear in a single event. Run that pattern across a few thousand years of intermittent warfare between farming settlements, and you get exactly the kind of bottleneck Carmen's team found in modern DNA. Out of all 18 scenarios the team tested, only the versions built around patrilineal clan structures reproduced the bottleneck. Every version of the model that dropped that specific social arrangement failed to match the data, regardless of how much outright violence got layered on top of it. Later work building on this idea gave the underlying mechanism a name: cultural hitchhiking. The concept borrows from genetics, where a neutral gene can spread through a population simply because it happens to sit next to a different gene that provides a real survival advantage. Applied here, a Y chromosome lineage did not need to belong to stronger or smarter men to spread widely. It only needed to belong to a clan that happened to practice successful farming methods, win enough conflicts, or simply outbreed its neighbors. The chromosome rode along with the clan's success, whatever that success was built on, and every less successful patrilineal line around it thinned out in comparison. The second explanation, published in 2024 by researchers including Leah Guyon and Raphael Shea, argues the same patrilineal clan structure could produce an identical genetic signature without requiring large-scale violence at all. Clans grow. Eventually they split, a process called lineage fission, with a portion of the group breaking off to found a new settlement elsewhere. Because these offshoot groups are made up of close male relatives, they carry only a narrow slice of the parent clan's total Y chromosome diversity from the start. Some of these new lineages thrive and expand over the following generations. Others struggle against poor harvests, disease, or simple bad luck, and fade out within a few generations without any outside violence involved at all. Repeat that splitting and fading process enough times across a few thousand years, and you can arrive at the same collapse in diversity purely through growth, division, and uneven survival. Carmen herself, when asked about the competing theories, noted that fighting clans could plausibly cause the kind of drop her team observed, while also cautioning that very little is actually known about how Neolithic societies were organized on the ground. Both explanations remain live possibilities among researchers, and they are not necessarily exclusive of each other. A society already organized into competing patrilineal clans could easily have experienced both processes running side by side. Some lineages dying out quietly through nothing more dramatic than bad luck, others being wiped out violently by their neighbors at sites like Talheim and Killianstaten. The skeletal evidence confirms that the violence was real, widespread, and specifically aimed at men and their male children. What remains genuinely unresolved, even now, is exactly how much of the total genetic collapse that violence can account for on its own, separate from the quieter mathematics of clans simply splitting and drifting apart. The killing did not stop after the Neolithic. In raw numbers, more people have died in warfare since this bottleneck than during it, especially once metal weapons and organized armies entered the picture centuries later. But something did shift over the following millennia. Trade networks formed between settlements that once would have raided each other. Diplomacy became a workable alternative to violence in situations where it previously was not. Measured against the Neolithic baseline, we are currently living through one of the more peaceful stretches in the entire history of our species, even accounting for the very real violence that still exists today. The average person now lives more than 3 times as long as a Neolithic farmer did. So the next time someone frames farming as the moment humanity finally got civilized, it is worth remembering what came bundled with it. The simplest invention in our history, a seed placed deliberately in soil, instead of gathered wild, rewired how humans related to land, to neighbors, and eventually to each other's odds of survival. It fed us. It also, for about 2,000 years, hunted a specific half of us with unusual precision. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. We are still here because enough men survived it, scattered thin across a handful of surviving lineages instead of hundreds. Every man alive today can trace an unbroken line back to one of those surviving 20th, whichever theory ends up explaining exactly how it happened. Whatever else that 2,000-year stretch cost us, it left behind exactly enough to keep going. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there. Skull pits included.